Truth be told, this isn't actually the first time I've ever given my testimony at a COS meeting. So in 1984, I was a first-year resident, and I came to a meeting, and I came on a grant. So those of you that are here on a grant, this is what you can look like in a few years. So it's it may not be so encouraging, but I met J. Lawton Smith at that meeting, and I was so impressed. Is it on?
Turn your microphone on.
Got it. How's that? Is that coming through now?
Perfect.
I met J. Lawton Smith at the meeting, and we got to talking, and so he asked me to come back the next year and share my testimony in 1985. And you know, when J. Lawton Smith asks you to do something, you do it. And so it was a great honor to be a part of that meeting. You know, one of the things for me, and I think this is my story, is that religion is just it's a set of beliefs that really can be very dry, and I don't know that religion does much to change people. But when you stop and think about what we've seen this week, a relationship with a living God can make a difference in changing a life. And I just went through some of the names this week. Jeff Jackson, who came from prison to purpose. Ming Wang, who you saw the transformation in his life through the movie. Our worship leaders last night, and I just was astounded at her story of having grown up in the home that she did, and here she is, just a beautiful woman singing about God's grace. It's because all of them met a living God, and it changed their lives. And that's sort of what my story is all about. It's all about the grace of God. So let me just, this is a story of my journey, and I think this will advance the pictures here. Maybe this side. Maybe that. There it is. There we go. So my story is I grew up in Los Angeles, California, small town in California, and was a pretty typical kid up until about the age of 12. I actually am Jewish. I grew up in a Jewish home, and I was in Hebrew school until the age of 12, and I was really excited about getting bar mitzvahed because when you get bar mitzvahed, you oftentimes get a lot of financial gifts. And a 13-year-old kid, that means a lot to you. And I was pretty excited about that when my world fell apart. So my father, when he was 13, his father, in the middle of the Depression, his father left his mom, my grandmother, with 3 boys, and my dad had to go to work at the age of 13 to help support the family. I found out at one time, my father, they were in Chicago, and during the Depression, they had a deal then where if you paid for a month of rent, you got a month of rent for free. And my father and his family, his mother and his 2 brothers, moved 6 times that year because they could pay for a month of rent and get a free month and then move somewhere else. My dad, as a result of that kind of an upbringing, had some real anger issues, but it was also something that caused him to be a very driven man. Well, at the age of 12, some of those anger issues erupted, and my mom and my dad separated. And actually, at that time, my dad moved to Minnesota, of all things. So here we are back where he left and came to. Back in those days, most of you are familiar with divorced families, but it was a fairly rare thing back in those days for a family to be divorced. And so from the age of 12, my world fell apart. My mom had to go to work. I could no longer go to Hebrew school. I was not able to get bar mitzvahed. And things just spiraled down. My mom was at work, and so we would come home and basically be doing, growing up and running things. At the age of 16, I was advanced in school. So at the age of 16, I was about to enter my senior year of high school when my mom met a man who lived in Hawaii. And my mom decided she wanted to remarry, and that was great. I was happy for her. But she gave me the option at the age of 16 that I could move with her to Hawaii, or I could stay in Los Angeles and finish my senior year. And in order to do that, she would leave me with the house until it sold and a car. Now, for those of you, especially those of you that are young parents, I don't recommend that as a good parenting tool, because it was not great. And you can imagine what a senior in high school living all by himself, the kind of trouble that you could get into. I was a good enough student that I was able to get into college, and so a year later, at the age of 17, I started at the University of California in Davis, which is in Northern California. But by then, my study habits and my life for a year of debauchery had really fallen apart. So I went to a year of college, and this was in 1972, and it was right about the time, for those of you that have a little bit of gray up on your crown will remember, that was a really disturbing time in the country. The Vietnam War was kind of being questioned, and we had a lot of social upheaval, and so I went off to college and had no idea what I was going to do, and had been living on my own for a year, and so I didn't have the greatest study habits. I took a year of college, and in that year I finished 9 hours. I had a 1.6 GPA, and that was only possible because Davis had started at that time an option called Pass No Record. So if you took a class and you passed it, it went on your record. If you didn't, there was no record of it. So I had 9 hours with a bunch of no record and a whopping 1.6 GPA. I spent the summer between that first year. I went to visit my mom for a week or two, and it was my first introduction to Hawaii, and I thought, this could be a place where I could see myself at some point. And then I spent the rest of the summer, I came back, and I spent the rest of the summer hoboing. So I was riding freight trains, and I went from California up through the Northwest and wound up in Chicago. And that's a whole nother story. At the end of that summer, I was supposed to go back to college, and I sort of thought about starting college, and I was thinking to myself, what in the world am I doing here? And that was then the beginning of one of the first really good decisions in my life, which is I said, I'm not gonna waste any more time in college. So I dropped out of college at the age of 18, and I moved to Hawaii. And I moved to the island. My mom was living in Honolulu, but that was too much of a city. So I moved to the island of Kauai, and some of you have probably been there. I think is this the little laser pointer here? I don't know if there's a little laser pointer on this thing, but anyway, the blue line on that, or the red line on that turns blue, is the road, and then there's a section of the island that there's just no road, and I'll show you why. It's a pretty rough section of coastline. When I first moved there, I lived at the very end of the road, right where it'll say something like Hyena State Park. There was a group of, for lack of a better term from back in those days, hippies that were living there in little tree houses that they built. A place called Taylor Camp, and it's gotten to be a pretty famous little area. It was actually land that was owned by Elizabeth Taylor, and she gave it to her brother, and brother thought it was kind of fun to have these people living on the property. And so I set up a little tent there and lived there for 6 months in my tent. During that time, I was kind of learning some skills about how to live as an islander. So I would work for some of the locals, and I learned how to use what looked like a machete. We called it a cane knife, and I'd clean up their yards and do things like that to help out. And I would make shell necklaces. Back in those days, there was a thing called puka shell necklaces that were real popular, and I would string puka shells and sell them to some of the tourists, and that's kind of how I made my living for 6 months, just living in my tent at this little hippie camp at the end of the road. I then got a job in the town of Honolulu, and at that time Honolulu was about 300 people. We had a post office that doubled as a general store, and then a couple of restaurants. And I worked in one of the little restaurants, and my job was to I cooked dinner Friday and Saturday night, and then I made lunch, and the rest of the time I could surf and just play at the beach and do kind of hippie things. So I lived at that time in the storeroom of the restaurant, which was about a size of a closet, not even a walk-in closet, but it was a small closet. I'd just stretch out my sleeping bag, and I'd live there, and then I'd get up in the morning and start making breakfast, and or make dinner and do lunch. About 6 months into that period of time, we oftentimes, and I love what Ming Wang said about discrimination. If you happen to be if you're in Hawaii and you happen to be white, the locals have a term for that called haole. And there was a lot of discrimination between the locals and the white people. They didn't like the haoles. And so one night in our restaurant, there was for lack of a better term, it looked like one of these things that you'd see on an old Western movie where there was a brawl that broke out between the locals and the rest of us. And it was like chairs were flying and fists are flying. It was just like a melee, a total brawl. My boss at that time I was probably 19 at the time, or just turning 19. My boss was a 25-year-old fella who was a Vietnam veteran, and I thought the world of this guy, because he seemed like a man of distinction at 25, and he was somebody I could look up to. And in the middle of this brawl, my boss took a bottle of wine, a full bottle of wine, and busted it over one of the locals' heads and turned around and handed me the bottle. And the local was a big dude, and he was kind of stunned, but he turned around, and I'm standing there holding this bottle, and he literally just grabbed me and just lifted me off the ground and reared back. And I knew the guy, and we'd been out surfing, and I told him, I said, I just want you to know I didn't do it, but if you do what you got to do. But it had a lasting impression upon me, because to this point, there's several things that I'd learned about life. With my family falling apart, the first lesson that I learned is love isn't real. Like there's no real love, because my mom and dad separated, and they both had different stories about what had happened, and so I couldn't believe in love. And then this lesson taught me that you can be betrayed by people that you think you love, that you can trust. And he just basically left me hanging, and I was about to get my head punched off. But I just told this guy, do what you got to do, and for some reason he just put me down, and I lived, walked out of there. But I didn't want to work in that restaurant anymore. And so at that point, I was fairly disillusioned. We had an outbreak of hepatitis on the island. And there's a resort. Many of you probably, maybe some of you have been to Kauai. There's a large resort that's there now, but was just being built when I was there, called Princeville. And if you've been to Princeville, you know what I'm talking about. It's a fairly luxurious, nice resort. They were just starting up in our little town, and the health department came in and said there was an outbreak of hepatitis, and it started in our restaurant. They didn't like it because we were a bunch of hippies running a restaurant. And so they said, you're going to have to close down the restaurant because of this hepatitis. It turned out it wasn't our restaurant. It was up at Princeville where the outbreak had started. But by that time, we had closed our doors, and I thought, I've had enough of this. Love doesn't work. Your friends betray you. I'm going to move and just live out in the jungle. And so I told you how this road goes around the island in a horseshoe, and there's this section of the island where it's just kind of just about half or about a third of the way there's a trail that you can walk that's 11 miles, and then the rest of it is just bare cliffs that you really can't, there's no way to walk it or drive it. You can take a boat around there or not. But I thought, I'm done with this, so I loaded up my backpack and I walked that 11 miles and started building a house. And so this is what that coastline looks like. You can see why you can't build a road there. It's a very rugged coastline, and the trail that goes along that coastline literally goes from sea level up to about 3,000 feet at times with different switchbacks, and it does that for about 11 miles. It's a very rigorous trail. But that was my doorstep, and I hiked out there and took my backpack and built a tree house in this valley that I just showed you. And so this is some of the what the trail looks like. You can see the kind of the cliffs, and you would kind of traverse around and in between these cliffs, and that's where I lived. Here you can see that little strip, if I have my laser pointer, but you can see that little strip. That's the trail as it sort of winds around. And if you look at this, I go what would be your lower right-hand corner where there's that brown, that's actually parts of the trail that I'm taking this picture from. Back in those days, we didn't have cell phones. Cell phones weren't invented, so I don't have a lot of pictures. The ones that I have are of pretty poor quality that I've been able to save, but you'll see some of the pictures. So that's the trail, and I would do that trail, 11 miles in that trail, with about a 70-pound backpack, barefoot, in about 3 hours. And so this is kind of what it looks like when it rains. It would get real wet, and it's just kind of a jungly trail. I've embedded a little piece, and I hope this will play. This is what some of that trail looks like. This is nowadays. They didn't have those signs back then. Huh? I learned to be back then, yeah.
What do you think about that?
Oh, that was terrifying.
So that's the end of that
of
section
adrenaline.
there. Another section of the trail, but there were parts of this trail that if it rained real bad, you could see it would just wash out. And so if I'm in there, I'm stuck, or if I'm out, I can't get back home. But again, with enough pharmaceutical help, I would just do this trail. I mean, this was just that's just what I did, and that's how I lived, and I lived back there for a year and a half. And so when I would run out of supplies, I'd have to run that trail out and go to that little store that I'd mentioned to you that was in Honolulu where I worked, and I'd load up with rice and beans and matches and candles and things that I needed that I couldn't grow or produce, and then I'd run back in and keep doing my life. And so that was pretty much my address. And here's another picture of the trail. And that's when you get to the end of the trail, there's a beach. And you can kind of see there there's a little waterfall that comes down onto that beach. And so it's a really, really nice little area. I didn't live on the beach because people that would hike the trail would sometimes make it to the beach. And we didn't, if you're living back there, you don't want anything to do with that. So I lived up in the valley about another mile and a half and built a tree house in there. I've got a few pictures. That's the valley. And I wish I could kind of, if I had my laser pointer, but if you see where the dip is, about halfway up that valley, just on what would be your left side is where I built my treehouse, just off a little stream. The wettest spot in the world happens to be at the top of the mountain of this island, and so the rivers that came down off of there, you could literally drink the water out of the stream fresh. You didn't have to purify it at all. And so I built my little house right next to a stream and could live just very easily right there. And this is that's me in the middle. Back when I like to say that was my wife's first husband when he had hair, back when he had hair. But that was, I'd hiked out. I think that was a picture that I took with my brothers when I finally came out of the jungle. So I'd been living back there a little bit, but you can see the fine physical shape that I was in there to run that trail. I do think that I'd like to have thought I could have been an Olympic runner at that point, but this is so. What do you do back there when you're just living in the jungle? Well, you learn to live in the jungle, and I'd gotten a few skills. So my tree house was basically built with bamboo that grew wild in those valleys, and I'd take bamboo and lay it down I'd had rope, and you lay it down basically and make a platform, and you could build walls with it. And then I used my cane knife to split and quarter the bamboo and weave it into a mat, and you could lay it out, and so it would cover all the little valleys and ridges around this round bamboo. So it'd be a nice flat pattern. This is one of the little tables that I built that was my kitchen, and you can see there's a cloth there, a red cloth, and then right at the end of that you can see those split bamboo that I'd use to make a nice flat surface. And any time I'd have a can or something, you'd use those to store things, and that was kind of what I did. I did have, there was a terraced wall back there, a rock wall, and I was able to dig some of that out. And I was down at the beach one time, and I found an oil drum, a 55-gallon oil drum that had floated up on the beach from a tanker, and I dragged that back up the valley and was able to get a little piece of garden hose and just by gravity stick it in the stream and run that water down and put water into that oil drum and build a fire underneath it. And then I took a piece of bamboo that I built a pole and had a little rod that came out with a coffee can that I pounded holes in the bottom of it. And you could run hot water into there and mix it with that stream water and get a nice hot shower. So I had a hot shower back there and had a nice table. And then I do a lot of, you have to live, so I grew everything pretty much that I would need to eat. This is one of the banana trees that I planted. You can see a little bit of the fence. There were some wild goats back there, and so I had to keep the goats out of my garden. This is a papaya tree that I planted, and I had a bunch of trees that I'd plant, avocado trees and papayas, and then there was a lot of trees that you would do that you could go and scavenge. And this is another picture. It's kind of, again, this is an old picture from the 70s of a little camera. I had flowers so you could have some aesthetics and, just all kinds of vegetables and food that I could eat. That's my tree house. It was kind of built very simply. I carried back some plastic to use as my roof. There was no walls because you really didn't need any kind of walls. So I spent a lot of time scavenging food. There was wild orange trees back there. There was mango trees. There was guavas. There was mountain apples. I would do a little bit of time kind of gathering wild watercress and herbs that the Hawaiians used. And then the rest of the time I would just do exploring. And a couple of times, I think I showed you the pictures of that coastline. Well, this trail only went 11 miles of that coastline, and so since this was my backyard, I wanted to kind of know what was there, and so on several occasions I'd swim the rest of that coastline. It was an 18-mile swim, and I would just swim along that coastline in the ocean and then kind of come ashore to explore some of these valleys and then get back in the water. And I'd have to tie a little bag of clothes with me, so because when I got out at the end of the road, I needed some clothes to put on. And so back where I lived, clothing was optional. And so anyway, I did a lot of exploration to find out if there was food or something else that you could eat back there or something that you could use. The other thing that I did, which began my journey, so at this point I had never heard the gospel. I had no idea what all of you in this room know. I was just a kid who was disillusioned. And I began to find out two things. Number one, here I am living in one of the prettiest, most beautiful spots in the world. And I began to realize that this doesn't happen by accident. There's just too much order and beauty. And as the sun came up every morning, and I'd get to see this sunrise over my valley, and I'd think, there's too much art here. This doesn't happen by accident. There's some beauty in this creation, although I couldn't figure it out. And what I didn't know then was what Psalm 19 says, that the heavens declare the glory of God. And they just cry out in any language how great God is, that there is a creator. And I began to realize there had to be a creator. The other thing that I began to understand is if this is so beautiful, then why is there something in me that seems so broken? And I couldn't sort that out, because to that point, most of my life was, how do I live to make me happy? And I realized a couple things. Number one, happiness is very different than joy. Happiness you can have for a moment, but joy lasts even in the hard times. And as much as I tried to fill my life with moments of happiness, whether it was through pharmaceutical help or otherwise, they didn't seem to last. There was no lasting joy. And the other thing that I began to realize is that, and I made a quote, a life absorbed in self doesn't bring meaning to life. It's only the one who designs self that can. And I began to realize there's got to be some purpose. And so every time I would hike out to town, which was about once a month, to go get supplies, and what I would do is, full disclosure here, is I would take some pharmaceuticals that I was growing and trade them for supplies. That's how I'd make money. And I'd go out there and I'd trade herbs, let's say. I would trade herbs for supplies. And I would get rice and beans and other things. But I would always, whenever I was out there, I would always pick up a book on religion. And I read almost every kind of Eastern religion. I read all, back in those days there was a bunch of stuff called New Age. I'd read that. And I mean, man, I would really get into it. And I read by candlelight at night. I had a little jar and I'd light a candle and I'd read. Along with teaching myself to play some guitar, I'd read stuff at night. And what I found out was that every book that I read said, you just have to keep getting better. You just have to keep doing more. And if you do enough, that maybe you'll get there. And I would do bizarre things to get better. One book suggested maybe if you fast and you cleanse yourself. And at one point I fasted for 2 weeks, nothing but water. It's hard to do living out in a place like that. But I would do all these things to try and somehow see if I could ever be worthy. But all along I knew that deep inside it was still just about me. There was nothing outside of me that was worth living for that I could find. So I've realized love doesn't work, and I've realized that you can be betrayed by people who you think like you. And I'd also realized there's got to be something out there that made all this, but I have no clue, and I'm not good enough to fit into all this at this point. Well, at this point, I was writing a bunch of letters to my dad. Now, let me backtrack for you, because my dad, when he left at age 12, we didn't have a great relationship. I was pretty mad at my father, and I don't know about any of you, but like, I never did anything wrong, and my dad would beat me. Did you ever have that problem? Like, I would get beaten for doing, because in my mind, I'd never done anything wrong. So if I stole something and my dad wanted to discipline me, it was his fault. Well, my dad and I were not close, and when he moved out, I thought, wow, this is going to be some great freedom. And after a while, I thought, well, after about 4 or 5 years, I thought, I want to get to know my dad. I didn't know him, and so I went up to visit my dad. And my dad had some really strange rules. Weird things, like rules like this. Like if I'm in his house, he gets to set the rules. Who has those ideas? I mean, those are weird ideas. But And so we didn't get along real well. And at one point, I told my dad, just before I left for Hawaii, I don't care if I ever see you again. I don't care if you live or die. I don't want to see you. That's how bad things have gotten. Well, I'm living out in Hawaii, and I've now built a house. I'm providing for myself. I'm a man. And I've really figured out, like, now I've got a reason for living, and I'm writing letters to my dad, and I'm explaining to my dad what I'm doing. And there's some very hilarious things that I'm explaining about what I'm doing out here. But I'm starting to figure out, I'm feeling good about myself, and I'm really feeling like I found my purpose, which is to just live out in the jungle and be happy, or so I could speak. My stepmother, my dad died many years ago, but my stepmother passed away recently. And as my brothers were going through her house, they found these letters that I wrote to my dad. And so these are now like 40 some odd years old, and they're just, so I have these letters that I wrote to him, and they're just, this is like if the house is on fire, I'm grabbing this notebook, because this is pretty special. The other thing that I did while I was out in the jungle, I'd sometimes I'd follow wild bees and collect honey, stuff like that. You learn to do stuff like that. One of the things I learned to do is kind of some of the Hawaiian crafts. So I started making baskets like the Hawaiians did, and here's one of my baskets. And this thing's it's 48 years old. And it still kind of works. It's just, and it's made totally of plants. There's no artificial, there's no thread or sewing. It's just plants that you learn to do stuff like the Hawaiians do. So I've got these are two of my most precious belongings right there. Well, I started writing these letters to my dad. And over a period of 3 years, I wrote these letters, but I just didn't send them. And so at the end of 3 years, after I've been there, I'm living in the tent, and I'm living in the restaurant, and I'm living out in the house for a year and a half. And I'm figuring this is the rest of my life. I went out to town one time, and for no reason at all, I decided I'm going to send these letters. And I put all these letters in an envelope and sent them to my dad. And then hike back in. Next time I hike out to town, there's a letter from my dad. Now, it's funny because at this post office, it's like all there is one little lady that works there, and she would later say, the U.S. government will only allow letters to be delivered to people that have like a driver's license or some form of ID or an address. Well, when you're living out in the jungle, I don't have an address, and I didn't have any ID. And so this lady would she would memorize every person's face that was like a hippie out there. And so she would know you, so she could then deliver the mail. So I'd come out, hi, Dan, how you doing? You got a letter from your dad. How do you know it's from my dad? She'd know everything. So I get a letter from my dad, and my dad says to me, if you'll just come home, as you can imagine, if you'll just come home, I'll buy you some land. You can live here. Anything. I'll do anything if you'll just come home. So I thought, well, here's a chance. And so I hike back in, I load up, and fortunately I took my basket and a few like precious things, because I'm thinking I'll go visit my dad, and that'll be the end of it. And so I loaded up my pack, picked up enough of my herbs so I could trade to buy an airline ticket. And I buy an airline ticket, and I go to California to visit my dad. He had moved back to California by this point. I visit my dad, and I'm there for a couple of days, and my dad still has these crazy ideas about rules in his house, and I'm not having it. And I haven't lived indoors now for several years, and so I'm thinking I can't handle this. And I move over to he had moved back to Davis. There was a hippie house on the campus at Davis, and I asked these guys, can I live in your garden? And they thought this was the coolest thing that there was. So I'm living in their garden. And I'd had enough. I was there about 3 or 4 days. My dad and I were not seeing eye to eye. And at that point, I went to my dad's house to leave. And I was going to say goodbye to my dad. It was 5 o'clock. This is July 26th, 1976. And I was at my dad's house. My youngest brother was in the shower because he had just finished 2-a-days for high school football. My dad was at work, and there's a knock on the door, and I was the only one that answered the door. And I answered the door, and there's two guys standing there. And the one guy says to me, if you were to die today, do you know for sure you'd go to heaven? And I looked at him and I said, I know there's something broken inside of me, and I'm pretty sure that if there is a heaven, I'm not going there. And these guys said, well, it's 5 o'clock. We got to, no, they didn't say that. These guys were doing what was called evangelism explosion, if some of you remember that program back in the day. These two guys had committed to knock on every door in this whole section of this town. It was July 20, for the whole summer. It was July 26th, so over half the summer, and they'd not had one person that was interested in talking to them. And they were standing out on the corner at 5 o'clock thinking, they literally asked each other, should we do one more door? And they knocked on my dad's door, and I wouldn't have been there the next day. And I answered the door and opened the door, and they said, if you were to die today, or do you know for sure you'd go to heaven? And I told them what I said, and they said, well, could we tell you about Jesus Christ? And they began to explain to me how none of us can be good enough. That's why God had to send his son who gave his life for us so that we could have his righteousness and get rid of our sin. And I just remember saying to those guys, if that's not true, I have no other hope. But I couldn't be certain. I said, well, is there something I can read about that? And they said, why don't we pray? And I prayed with them this. I said, God, if you're real, would you make yourself known to me? Because I have no idea. Now keep in mind, I'd been taught most of my life that the Christian Bible was heresy up until the age of 12. And so I said, I'll just read it. I'd read everything else, and none of it mattered. No, I said, I'll just read it. And so they gave me a Bible, and they said, can we come back and visit you? And I went home that night, and I'm now, I've made this prayer of okay, God, if you're really out there, would you make yourself real to me? There was 8 hippies living in this hippie house where I'm in the garden, and I go back to my garden, and these 8 folks go, what'd you do today? I said, I asked Jesus Christ into my life, and let me tell you about that. And I was telling them about it. 5 of them asked Jesus Christ into their life from a guy who didn't know anything about the Bible. That's just an act of God. And so these guys gave me a Bible, and I started reading, and I just consumed it. And as I read it, my heart just burned. I read about John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish, that I could become a child of God. And it just made all the sense in the world. And I just began to pray. And so these guys would come visit me. And as I was reading this thing, so they came back and visited me a couple days later, and they said, you need to stay here. You can't go back to Hawaii. You need to stay here and go back to school. So now it's August, and I'm trying to explain to them, you guys don't understand. I've got a house. I've got a garden. I can't leave. What are you guys talking about? They said, and so here was the deal. This was University of California at Davis. You need to reapply to Davis in August. And that was the deal I made them. I said, I'll tell you what, it's August. I'll apply. But if I don't get in for the September semester, I have nothing to do here. I'm going back home. So I'm going to apply to the University of California in August to start the next month. I got in. And so I began to read my Bible, and let me tell you this side story. As I read my Bible, one of the first things that came to mind was honor your father and your mother. And so I went back to my dad's house. I wasn't living there. I went back to my dad's house, and I said, Dad, could I sit down and just talk to you? And for an hour, I just confessed how I dishonored my dad for my whole life. It was just the conviction of God. And I just said, God, I'll do anything you want me to do. And I will also tell you that on that first day, the conviction of God came over me and convicted me that I didn't need to be using any herbs anymore. And I quit that day. And the conviction of God came over me, and I said, Dad, I just want to tell you how rebellious I've been, and I just want to honor you. And I'd never seen my dad cry, but he crying about an hour. He didn't say a word. I'd never seen my dad sit still that long for an hour. And so I had an opportunity for the next few years to go over to my dad's house and just honor him. And I'd work in his garden because I knew how to garden. I'd mow his yard. I'd cook food for him. I'd do anything I could just to hang around him. And when he died, we had become really, really best friends. It was just a gift from God to give me that relationship back. So I applied. I got into school. I got a job and worked my way through college. And it was when I first started school, I asked the Lord, what do you want to do with my life? Because I'm one of those people that the scripture says this, he who's been forgiven much. And I could tell you a lot of stories, but God forgave a lot. I was 21 years old at this time. He who has been forgiven much loveth much. And I was in love with God. So what do you want to do with my life? And God said, why don't you, it wasn't an audible voice, but it was such an impression. Why don't you do something where you can help people? I had enrolled in agriculture thinking, I know how to farm, which was my little garden. And at Davis, it's like a small farm is 10,000 acres. You know, it's like they produce food for the world. But I know, so why don't you do something where you can help people? And as I thought about everything possible, I just came to medicine. You can help people doing medicine. And then I reminded God, you realize I've got a 1.6 GPA. This is probably not going to happen. God said, just go for it. And so 3 years later, I was able to get into medical school. And during that time, I met my wife, and God gave me a great companion, just a sweet woman. She has the exact opposite testimony. I like to say that I met my wife, her parole officer introduced us, but she grew up in an absolutely wonderful Christian home and never strayed, and just how she fell in love with me, I have no idea. That's a gift of God. But when I finished medical school, I asked the Lord, what do you want to do with my life? What part of medicine can I do where I can serve people? And as I looked at every specialty, it just became clear that ophthalmology was one of those areas where I can go, and God kind of laid it on my heart, do something where you can go anywhere in the world. And so I thought, as I looked at every specialty, I thought there's none better than ophthalmology. I can go out and fix blind people. And so I went into ophthalmology, and then I met people like Lawton Smith and some of you that are out here that inspire me to such a great degree. Lowell Guess is one of those guys that comes to mind. I could stand play. I mean, there's so many of these guys that are just role models. And so I said, Lord, that's what I'll do. And so I started doing mission work my very first year out of residency, and every single year that I've been in practice, and I'm in solo practice, every single year we've done mission work, because I can go to places that pastors and missionaries can't go and share the gospel with people that are lost. And so it's really nothing about me. It's about God who would take and redeem somebody like me. And so I have the privilege of using the gifts that God has given me to literally go into countries. You know, I heard it was at this meeting, I think there's 50 countries where a missionary cannot go. An American missionary is not allowed. But there's only one country in the world where an American doctor cannot go. And you can imagine it's a pretty short list. I'm sure most of you could figure out what that country is. I've been in most of the others where an American missionary can't go, but a doctor can, and had the privilege to share Christ literally all over the world. I will tell you the conclusion of that story, and then I want to leave you with one other thought. I'm going to switch topics, but we were in Honduras one time at a mission project, And it was the second to last day that we were there, and a young man came in who had been blind his whole life from cataracts, and he was 21 years old, and his mother led him in, and we examined him, did all of his measurements. We had a portable A scan. We do his A scan, and some of you may remember back in these days, this was back in the early 80s, he measured out where he needed a 10 diopter lens. And back in those days, the IOL companies didn't have large consignments that we would give. In fact, in my community, in my hospital, I would have to special order a 10 diopter lens. They just didn't give you the whole range of lenses. There weren't that many. And here we are in San Pedro Sula Hospital in Honduras, which is basically a little hospital where you had to bring your own soap. They'd had a couple of missionaries that had been there, but there was this young man, and he needed a 10 diopter lens, and I didn't have one. And I just was broken. I thought, we can't help him. I said, let me just go and look in this storeroom. I know there's been a couple of people here in the past. I'll go look. And I go into this storeroom, and it's a little wooden room, and there's a shelf, and there's nothing on the shelf but one box. And it's a 10 diopter lens, just by coincidence. And man, we're rejoicing. We go, yes, we can do his surgery. And so we do his surgery, and it was one of these lenses where a lot of you guys will know, like it was one of those lenses where all the cortex sort of had been sucked out, and the lens was just like a little disc between two little closed up pieces of capsule. And it was a tough surgery, and it was really, I don't even know how we got the capsule apart, but we put this lens in, and we're rejoicing, and I'm thinking, oh man, I don't know if that's going to help. It was such tough. Anyway, the guy leaves. Next day we're packing up, and he doesn't show up. And we're kind of disappointed, and we have to load our bus because we're supposed to be leaving. We've loaded up, we've folded up all of our microscopes and our equipment, and we put it on the bus, and this guy doesn't show up. And finally, as we're just about to get on the bus, here comes his mom leading this little guy, and we're just excited. And what had happened was that they had missed their bus, and they had to walk 3 hours to get to us. So she's led him for 3 hours, and they get here. We pull out some chairs, and we sit him down, and we pull off his patch. And I go, how many fingers up there? And he gets this look on his face like he can see. And he looks over at his mom, and for the first time really in his life, he can see his mom, and he starts to cry. And then his mom realizes he can see him, and she starts to cry. And then my wife, who's there, sees all this. She starts to cry. And then I just have to say, woman, pull it together. No, I didn't say that. I'm crying, and man, I mean, it's just a crazy scene, and the guy is like seeing like perfectly good. He came back the next year we went there, and he's just seeing great. Well, we're flying home, and I'm on the window seat, and I don't know, if I was the only guy in the plane that kind of heard anything, and I don't think there was anything audible, but I was just talking to God, and I was just saying, God, like you can imagine, if that guy was the only reason we went on this trip, I've got to shut my practice down, we've got to pay, bills to pay, but if he was the only reason that we went on this trip, it was worth it. And I'm certain I'm hearing this stuff. I don't know if anybody else does, but I'm hearing this thing like, Dan, how long did you know that guy? Like, you didn't know that guy, and you could get that much joy out of serving him. And he said, I just want you to know this, that if you were the only reason I came to earth and gave my life, it was worth it. And that's how I knew that I knew how much God loved me. And he loves you and can change your life. Well, I want to switch gears with that testimony. I want to just switch gears a little bit because we're doing something really cool, and I don't want you to miss out on this because it's really cool. Not every one of you is going to go overseas and do mission work. I believe I was called to do it by God. I think that's why he restored my life and led me into ophthalmology so I could go. My plan was to be a full-time missionary, and if there had been MedSend back in those days, I literally would have been a full-time missionary. By the time I paid off my school loans, I literally did apply to the Foreign Mission Board, and they turned us down because we had too many kids by that point. And I'm thankful because God was using us doing these short-term projects and using us in our community. But I want to throw out this seed to the Christian Ophthalmology Society that's pretty cool, is that I believe, like one of the things when I go overseas, I can go to a country, and I'm talking hard countries, Muslim country. I can go to a country and I can draw a crowd because I'm not on the street corner saying, here's a Bible, who wants to learn? I'm on a street corner going, who's blind? Bring me your blind and we'll help you. And then I can tell them about Jesus. And they will listen. But they're coming because of a need. And I believe that in our country, here in the United States, we're growing to a place where if we just open our church doors, people aren't coming. They don't come because they don't perceive a need. And we've got to figure out, how do we get to where they are at? And I believe God has strategically positioned us as doctors in our communities to reach our communities. So here's something that we started doing a couple of years ago, and this is just our practice. So a couple of years ago, I said, how do we reach our community? And where are the lost in our communities? And I realized a lot of the lost in our communities are in our public schools. And so I met with a superintendent of our school district, and I said, is there a way, like we have all these churches with all these people that have all these resources, is there a way we could partner with the school and bring some of these resources in to be a blessing? Now, your community, it may be something different, but we thought this is how we'll go and reach where they're not being reached. And he said, gosh, we would love to have some people like you guys. And so we started this thing called Palestine Mentoring. And Gold Eye Clinic, which is my clinic, and Max Sue's eye clinic, we literally hired on our staff a woman who her sole job is to run Palestine Mentoring. That's what she does. She doesn't see patients or do billing, but she runs Palestine Mentoring for us. And the first year, I went around to every church in our community, and I said, would you guys like to get involved in reaching our schools, partnering with teachers that are on the front line and bringing resources to bear into our schools so that we can reach kids that aren't going to come to our churches? And so we started this. The first year we had 12 mentors. I think we had 5 or so churches involved, and we had 50 kids that came to our mentoring program. The second year we had 50 mentors from 12 different churches, people that would go once a week into the school, and we had 140 kids in our program. And some of the things that we do, they've invited us. Now, this is the school has asked us to come and just do a prayer walk around the school. And so we go and pray through the hallways. We greet students as they arrive in the morning off the buses. We just give them a high five and just tell them how much we love them and somebody cares about them. And then there's various groups that kids will meet into. So one of our mentors is teaching kids guitar. One of our mentors, or several of them, are doing crafts with kids after school or before school. I love this guy. He pastors a local church in town. He has the men of character, and he gets his kids together, and he literally prays over his kids, and he takes them fishing, and he does stuff with his kids. We have a chess group where this guy's teaching chess to the students. We found out that a lot of these kids, the one meal they may get that day is the meal that the school provides. And so we decided, why don't we see if we can send some food home with these kids? And so we started collecting meals and hygiene. Some of these kids don't have stuff to take a shower. And so we've started providing hygiene care for the kids. It's amazing. And I just say, I've lived in this community for a long time. You have no idea what you don't know. And how many needs are out there that we just had no idea. And now we're able to actually get involved with some of these kids. we had the other thing that we did is we did a staff appreciation where we went around and we bought popcorn and we gave movie tickets and restaurant coupons to not just the teachers, but to the cafeteria workers and the aides. And we just told them how much God loves them and we're thankful for them. And some of the teachers, there's usually a teacher appreciation day, but some of these cafeteria workers had never had anybody just say thank you. And it was so cool to tell them, hey, we're here. We want you to know we love you. And God loves you. So we started doing that. And then we did a little spring program with our kids where the parents could come and meet their mentors. And and then we'd have luncheons where we'd come and bring our mentors and our mentees together, and we'd have a lunch together or a breakfast or a lunch. So this has been something that's really been exciting. It's been a really neat partnership between our eye clinic, mobilizing the churches in our community. And it may look a little bit differently. I think that's the last of my slides. It may look a little bit differently in your community, but one of the things that I'd love to challenge you to start thinking about is, could God use your practice in your community to reach your community? What could be done with the resources that God has given us in our practices to begin to reach our communities, not just in foreign countries, but here in our communities? I'm out of 10 seconds. I'll be happy to sit here and talk to anybody that would like to, but thank you so much for listening to me. I appreciate it. Lord bless y'all.
Hello to all my colleagues at Christian Ophthalmology Society. My name is Jonathan Shader.
Stan's got a presentation. Oh, questions.
No, we're just gonna, any questions or comments for Dan or Megan, huh? It's inspiring.
Yes. Oh, thanks, Gene. Oh, thanks, Gene. Yeah. I did go once, and it's about 10 years later, and I went back there. The tree house was gone because it's a jungle, and unless you're maintaining that stuff. But a lot of the trees that I planted are still there. I've wanted to take my kids, but it's a hard hike, and I have to get in a really good shape to get back there. So I'd like to rent a boat maybe and go back there, but I'm going to try and do that. I want to get my kids back there, but it really is. It's a very hard hike to get back there, but I did go back once and saw my place.
Thank you again.